My task now is just to introduce our main speaker and to give you a sense of how the evening will unfold. First, you'll note that we have several cameras here. One of those is live streaming tonight's event, so please recognize that we're live and on the air. When the time comes for audience questions, if you do line up in front of the microphone and we have time to take your question, please just recognize that what you say is you're saying it in public, and please identify yourself and be brief, and if you could ask a question of either Secretary Stengel or any of the panelists, that would be most appreciated. So we're really glad to have Rick Stengel with us tonight. He's a friend of the schools and a member of our tribe here in journalism land, and I just want to welcome him and thank him for choosing to be with us tonight. I'm going to introduce him now. He's going to make very brief remarks, and then he's going to take his place on the panel, and I'll introduce the distinguished respondents that we have, all of whom are deeply immersed in issues of free expression and press rights, both in this country and around the world. And our idea tonight is to have exchanges between Undersecretary Stengel and the panelists about the ideas that he introduces for discussion and any others that arise over the course of the hour. So Rick is a really remarkable professional who has crossed a lot of ground over the course of his life. He went to Princeton as an undergraduate and was a Rhodes Scholar, and then joined Time magazine. I'm not sure as many Rhodes Scholars today rush into journalism as did in his day, but it was a really remarkable early career he had as an editor at Time. He was their national editor for some time, a culture editor. We were chatting before we came down. It was a time when you could, at least if you were Rick Stengel, come and go from the magazine and write books and write freelance articles for Rolling Stone and other places. And that work took him to South Africa, initially to do magazine work and a journalistic book or two, and then ultimately to collaborate with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. And in 2006, Mr. Stengel became the managing editor of Time, which is, in effect, the executive editor, the editor-in-chief. And he stayed there until 2013. And so his foray into government life and public service at the State Department is really relatively recent in comparison to his long acquaintance with journalism. So, but he's now been there in Foggy Bottom long enough to have a few bruises and have at least a sense of the domain that he presides over, and so I look forward to hearing from him right now. Please welcome Rick Stengel.
Can I shut this computer, by the way? Will that collapse the whole evening? Steve, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And for those of you who are here at the journalism school, you're very, very fortunate to have Dean Coll as your leader. He is I think of this as the era of the player coach. And nobody practices journalism, important journalism, memorable journalism, journalism that affects the world in a higher or better fashion than Steve has done over the years. I don't know how your fundraising prowess is, but if it's anything like your journalistic prowess, you will be incredibly successful here. So you're very, very lucky to have him. I'm really, really pleased to be here. This really started with a conversation a number of months ago. I live about 20 blocks south of here. I commute to Washington, so I thought this is sort of my home game, and I'm pleased to have you host me tonight. I was going to try something a little bit different this evening, which is to actually give a speech, which I know you're so excited about. But this is so small and informal and intimate in a lovely way, I'll be a little bit more kind of spontaneous and not stick to what I have in front of me. So, Steve, thank you for having me. This is a super important discussion to have, and I want to thank, before they criticize me, Agnes, Ann, and Joel, who will be coming up on the panel. As Steve mentioned, I spent most of my career in journalism, and even though so many people in journalism who are my generation are down at the mouth about journalism, and certainly the equities of journalism and the financial basis of journalism has changed, I actually think there's never been a more exciting time to be in journalism than right now in my lifetime. And the reason is because the new platforms, the new tools of storytelling, I mean, you can do a better job, a richer job, really show the complexity of stories in a way using all of these various tools in a way that was very limited in my era. I mean, my era, we originally turned in our stories that were written on typewriters, on paper, in a little wooden box, and those days are gone. There's much, much more power that people have now. But even though it is an incredibly exciting time to be a journalist, it is also an incredibly challenging time. In fact, I think the challenges to journalism now are deeper and more profound and more disturbing than also any time in our lifetime. And I'm going to talk about basically three big challenges. There's the journalism safety. There's the challenge of the shrinking of the freedom of speech space. And then there's the rise of disinformation. I'm going to touch on all of those three things and talk a little bit about what the State Department is doing to combat some of those things, although it's very, very, very difficult. Again, I think as most of you know, the last 3 years have been the most dangerous and perilous time for journalism in memory. Just in 2014 alone, more than 200 journalists were imprisoned, more than 60 journalists were killed. Of course, we get most of these numbers from CPJ and the incredible work that they do that you'll hear more about tonight. In fact, oftentimes we're trying to serve what CPJ is doing. I come at this, having been a journalist for all of these years, being a devout believer in the power and importance of the First Amendment, with the idea that freedom of expression is a foundational human right. At the same time, having now been in government for about a year and a half, I see that freedom of speech, freedom of expression has different manifestations around the world. The US in many ways is an outlier on this. As a culture, we are almost absolutist in our defense of free speech. That doesn't exist everywhere, and it often causes some tension in our relationships. But going to that second matter of the shrinking of the freedom of speech space, the thing that I've seen since I've been in government is so many of this rise of countries with autocratic leaderships have realized that, in fact, you can shrink and narrow that freedom of speech space, that everything that we believed about the rise of the internet, that it was like air and this incredible never-ending supply of information, countries are realizing that they can crack down on that. They can erect firewalls. They can pass criminal defamation laws. They can pass restrictive NGO laws. All of those things begin to restrict that freedom of speech space, which already is different than it is in the US. So one of the determinations I have since I've been at the State Department is not only how to safeguard journalists, how to give them tools to keep them more safe, because the other thing that we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years is journalists, once upon a time, and Steve was in war zones, journalists had a kind of safe pass. You're trying to bring the truth to people. Now, journalists are targets of regimes, targets of folks like ISIL. Journalists themselves, because of what they do, have become combatants in a war zone. That's something that we all have to fight against and is a terrible challenge. Since I've been in this job and have traveled around the world, I see the incredible bravery and courage of so many journalists around the world, and the challenges that they face are really inconceivable to American journalists. Some of you, I hope and assume, are here at the journalism school. The threats and the challenges to American journalists pale, not that I want to underestimate what they are, but they pale compared to what foreign journalists in so many places around the world have to reckon with. They have to reckon with being put in jail. They have to reckon with being followed. They have to reckon with just the idea of practicing journalism is considered a crime in many places. Trying to speak truth to power, which is our definition of journalism, speaking truth to power in so many places around the world can get you jailed or even killed. So we have to combat that. The other thing that I've seen, and it doesn't get as much discussion, is what I call the rise of disinformation. And it's ironic because there's never been a greater, richer, more information age in history. All of human knowledge is at the touch of your iPhone. Google estimates that basically the amount of information that was created throughout human history till 15 or 20 years ago is now equaled every year. So there's this incredible rise of information. Yet at the same time, there's been almost a similar rise in disinformation and in false facts, whatever you want to call it. And one of my heroes, being a New Yorker, was Pat Moynihan, who was a senior senator from New York. And he used to have a lovely line where he would say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And everybody would nod their head. But now, more and more, we see people feel like, I'm entitled to my own facts. And I dispute those facts. There's no consensus anymore about what's true, even though the tools for finding out the truth, for finding out the reality, for finding out the facts are better than any time in history. And around the time that I came into office was the time we saw the Russian illegal annexation of Crimea. And one of the things I saw, even though I'd been in journalism and media my whole life, I saw the rise, I saw the extent, the power of Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And that's something that we're seeing in lots of different spaces around the world. And it is, I would say, an existential threat to freedom. It's a threat to our security, and it's a threat to this very, very basic idea that we have that there's a reality, there's a truth out there, which is something that journalists hold dear. That is under threat in a way that we haven't seen ever, I don't think. Someone said this about the Russian space, but it's true in general on this disinformation piece. It's not so much an information war, but a war on information, a war on the idea of truth. That so many of these bad actors, and we'll talk about them in a minute, one of whom is so-called ISIL, is not so much that they want you to believe their point of view, but they want to say that everybody's point of view, everybody comes at things in a venal way. There's no truth out there to be verified. So my big boss, President Obama, as well as my day-to-day boss, Secretary Kerry, has made it very clear that supporting freedom of the press is a critical element of U.S. foreign policy. I mentioned those three challenges that we're seeing out there, and I want to talk a little bit about what the State Department is doing to try to help some of those areas and how we could use your help as well. I mean, the panelists will talk about this, but even the folks here at the journalism school, there are things that we can do together because government isn't always the best messenger for our own message or even for some of the programs that we are creating. So in January, we had a meeting at the State Department that brought together stakeholders in the safety of journalism and the freedom of information space, like-minded governments, foundations, NGOs, to talk about some of the things that we could do. And there are a number of ideas that came up, which are things that we are now trying to do. One of which was the U.S. government has to prioritize journalistic safety in all of our bilateral discussions with governments around the world. That's something that the Secretary has put a great deal of emphasis on. And now that I am a diplomat, I am in the State Department, I have to say one of the things that's been actually wonderful and reassuring as an American is that behind the scenes in those rooms that I used to stand outside and take notes on, now that I'm in those rooms, I see over and over and practice it myself, American diplomats who are on the one hand saying, yes, here are these things that we think you're doing well, but there are these other things that we really need to talk to you about. And one of them is, repression of journalists. One of them is not allowing reporters to rove around and have free access to your people. One of them are these strict NGO laws that you have that are limiting that space. I mean, Diplomats all around the world do this day in and day out, and I have to say, as an American, it's something that has really made me proud. We want to create a network of organizations, NGOs, groups who can help journalists in conflict zones. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that people are creating apps for journalistic safety. It's been concentrated in Iraq and Syria, but these are things that can help journalists everywhere. And it's something that we want to help the private sector with, we want to help groups with, and we want to create a network of networks that can help journalistic safety. One of the other things that we're establishing at the State Department is a clear protocol for personnel at all of our posts around the world to help journalists who may be under threat, who may be under physical threat, whose safety is being challenged, and who are just not able to do the job that they're supposed to do. So we're creating protocols, sets of guidelines for people in all of our posts. We have, and there are public diplomacy officers and public affairs officers at hundreds and hundreds of posts and hubs around the world. They can be real allies for journalists, both American journalists there as well as international journalists and domestic journalists in that space. We're also working to expand safety training for local journalists through the State Department. We have Public Affairs Department, which reports up to me, has a very strong program about this. The Secretary is going to be talking about it. It's something that we can do to help journalistic organizations train their correspondents. You know, when I was editor of Time and sent young men and women who were journalists into harm's way, into Iraq, into Syria, into Afghanistan, there were obviously training and safety programs that we had to do, but this has to become something that is universal and ubiquitous, and we want to help with that. At the same time, we want to help journalists in those countries that have a much stricter, more narrow, more repressive free speech space to help them do what they do. We want our diplomats in all of those places to become the advocates for those journalists with their local governments and local handlers. In April, the State Department launched the 4th annual Free the Press campaign, which highlighted individual journalists who remain wrongly imprisoned. I won't go over that list. Joel knows it, chapter and verse much better than I do. But we realized that the U.S. government has to speak out all of the time for journalists who are wrongly imprisoned, who are held behind bars, who are not allowed to what they do. And as I say, we do this regularly behind the scenes in diplomatic give and take, but we need to do it publicly, and we need to do even more of it. And we can talk about cases later on, and there are cases that day in and day out we are talking to foreign governments about getting journalists released from prison. And then the other thing, and I alluded to it before, the rise of disinformation. The Secretary of State likes to talk about journalists as being truth tellers. And one of the things we have to do is to figure out how to enable journalists to tell the truth. What are the tools that we can help give them? What are the protections that we can help give them? What is the access that we can give them to people who can help them tell the truth? There's an area that I've been very focused on, which is counter ISIL messaging. I don't have to tell you about the rise of this terrorist group and the crisis that they have caused in the Middle East, and their very, very sophisticated use of social media. So just to remind people of what the State Department is doing, I wanted to use that as one example. So one of the entities underneath me as Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs is the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, which is a 24/7 entity that messages against ISIL, against Daesh, as we call it, which is the Arabic name. And so there are things that government can do in terms of corralling people, of helping journalists, but then we are also out there in that space, counterdicting, countermanding, creating different messages that try to prevent the rise of ISIL in the free speech space. They have been incredibly successful as we've seen other entities in kind of seeding, having an information predicate before they're out there in the military space. This is something that the military talks about in other areas as hybrid warfare, where hybrid warfare, which is the use of information to lay a predicate before military action, is another threat to journalism because it co-opts journalists. At the same time, in that effort, I just actually was in London last week. We convened the Counter-ISIL coalition, which is this, which is the messaging coalition of the 65 nations that are counter-ISIL. And we had representatives of Facebook, of Google, of Twitter, and some other technology companies there. And we have been trying to help those technology companies interdict that kind of negative messaging that is polluting their ecosphere. And I want to just put in a word for those companies that are doing actually incredible work in this area that people don't know about. Earlier in the summer, Twitter took down 10,000 handles that were promoting ISIL's noxious vision. They've been incredibly strong in that space, and government can actually help them do that. In this rise of disinformation, and being here at the journalism school, I want to talk about one value that was a value that I preached when I was in journalism, but I think it's something that the J School could do. One of the things I always tell my folks in the field is that there aren't two sides to a lie. With the rise of disinformation and propaganda, there is not just small manipulations of the truth, there are actual lies, made up facts. And one of the things that they depend on is journalists who feel that to be objective, you have to balance two sides. And there's a false equivalency if you balance a lie against the truth. I believe journalists have to call out the lie. One of the things I always told my folks at time was, you're an expert in this, you know what's wrong, you have to state your point of view. And I do believe that one of the aspects of 21st century journalism and all the tools that are at the disposal of 21st century journalism is that people have to be able to expose those lies. They can't balance something that is false against something that is true. So we're trying to support independent media around the world. We have a bunch of programs for journalists that I also want to promote a little bit tonight. Right now, there are 100 foreign journalists who are here on the Edward R. Murrow program that the State Department sponsors to go to newsrooms, to talk to editors, to promote these values of free speech. We have about 1,200 foreign journalists who participate in State Department programs, which range from support for investigative reporters in Kyrgyzstan, to bloggers in Brazil, to a program that we have in the Baltics that has awards for the best investigative journalism. That's something that we can help. And I just want to put in a pitch basically for the J School, for any students who are here, to try to help with some of those programs. You can participate in the Murrow program from both sides. You can participate in these exchange programs. I have actually always believed that I've been a public servant all of my life. I believe journalism is a public service. You know, the First Amendment protects journalism. It's the only amendment, it's the only part of the Constitution that protects an industry. It protects an industry because a democracy doesn't go of itself. As Jefferson said, a people can never be ignorant and free. So journalism is necessary in any kind of representative democracy. We want to support that around the world. We want to support that at home, and we want you all to get involved. So thank you for letting me talk tonight. Happy to participate in the panel as long as they don't hammer me too much, and eager to get your questions as well. Thank you very much.
Why don't the panelists come up, and we'll just move quickly to the next phase of our discussion. Rick, you can take any chair you like, and I'll just introduce our respondents briefly. So let's see in what order they're going to sit.
Are you going to sit up here?
I can. Maybe leave that one for me at the end, and okay, closest to me is Agnes Callamard. She's the director of the Columbia Global Free Expression Project. She's the former executive director of Article 19, the International Human Rights Organization. And she's been at Columbia. The project I mentioned involves documenting free expression jurisprudence worldwide and creating an international resource of understanding about how diverse and sometimes informal practices in judicial systems are closing, or one hopes at least once in a while, opening space for free expression. A very important work and very novel work here at Columbia. To her right, as we face you, is Ann Cooper. She's the CBS Professor of Professional Practice in International Journalism here at the J School. She's an award-winning reporter and foreign correspondent, 25 years of radio and print experience, notably as a correspondent in Russia and South Africa, among other places. And then closest to Undersecretary Stengel is Joel Simon. He's the executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which Rick referred to. And he's launched, among other things, since coming to CPJ and leading it so energetically, the global campaign against impunity to try to hold murderers of journalists accountable. And I should mention that Ann was the executive director of CPJ before she came to the J School, and it's great to see successors in a position like that, friendly and collaborative and mutually supportive. It's not always how the world works, so I admire them both for that as well. Our thought was that each of our panelists would just respond extemporaneously to Rick's remarks, which they didn't have any preview of other than just kind of broad brush what themes he was going to cover. I just want to take a note of the time. We want to save time for questions, so if each of you could really hold it to 5 minutes and check your watches, I'd be grateful for that. But Agnes, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your introduction. In my 5 minutes, I want to react to some of the points you've made by linking them to an issue which you took great pain to ignore discussing, which in my experience so far is really at the heart of some of the problems you've identified. This is national security, counterterrorism, public protest-related matters. In response to a monster, which you well highlighted, that of extreme violence, terrorism, mass violence, I think we too may well have created a monster. How does this work? I just want to highlight a few, 2 or 3 aspects of some of which you've hinted to, but didn't bring it back to the root causes. I understand press freedom here to mean the right to provide information and the right of the public to know. How does well-meaning national security concerns impacted greatly on, not only impacted on global press freedom, but actually have become the key threats to global press freedom? The first mechanisms has been overbroad and abused laws. You've mentioned charity laws, those that prevent foreign funding. You forgot to mention the origin of those laws. They are linked to counterterrorism. They are linked to an abuse of possibly what was, again, well-meaning, but they have been extended into a realm that may not have been planned for, but this is nevertheless the link. The foreign funding laws, 60 of which, at least at the moment, are preventing civil society from doing their work, are linked to counterterrorism. Anti-terrorism law, there has been at least 140 by 2012 that had been adopted around the world, all of which, according to Human Rights Watch, all of which abuse freedom of expression. The origin of those laws are again linked to a perspective and a conception of counterterrorism that, in my view, has not been well thought out when it was first came out. I should also mention the new generations of the laws that are curtailing free speech, intelligence, surveillance, anti-extremism, online content, and the pressure on intermediaries that you have mentioned. Those laws have been put to good use. As the Committee to Protect Journalists have highlighted successfully in their data on imprisoned journalists, At this stage, the majority of the journalists that are imprisoned on state security-related charges that include counterterrorism, national security, public order issues. Just to give you a few examples, over the last 1 week in Egypt, 3 journalists arrested on terrorism charges. In Turkey, we know what's happening on a regular basis. Ethiopia, good news, the Zone 9 bloggers have been released, but they remain in prison for a very long time. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, all of our big allies against ISIS that you mentioned, and the fight against terrorism, have imprisoned journalists, civil society activists. They have imprisoned actually the moderate voices that are supposed to be fighting ISIS. Those people are being silenced through the very tool that I believe Western powers, the United States included, have created. I'm not mentioning the UK that I think last week captured, so sorry, I forgot the word, captured the laptop of a British journalist. Third mechanism through which threat to press freedom is occurring is the silencing of dissent and the silencing of ourselves. I have no doubt that in the name of national security, the crazy global alliance to fight terrorism and the crazy global alliance to counter violent extremism, only very modest pressure is placed on the allies. I've heard you talked about the diplomats putting some pressure. There is no relationship between the pressure that is being put right now on UAE, among others, on Bahrain, on Saudi Arabia, on Turkey, compared to what may have been done a few years ago. We are silencing ourselves. We, meaning those governments, those countries, those individuals who in the past could have been at the forefront of fighting repression of press freedom. The language of traitors as permeating almost all of the political space, the public space, not only in the country that I have mentioned, but here too. We are denied access to information on national security grounds. I just want to mention a good news from last week. The forced feeding videos on Guantanamo, the judge Gladys Kessler has decided that those videos should be made available to the various newspapers that have requested access to them. Needless to say, the decision is now yet again appealed. So while I take, I'm pleased that you are mentioning the fact that press freedom and freedom of expression is an essential component of US foreign policy to me. From where I sit, from the work I do now, from the work I've done at Article 19, on the basis of my daily phone call with friends who are facing imprisonment or worse, to me this is an afterthought. And so, sir, to me, what you have done tonight is highlighting how press freedom has become a lip service in the name of a bigger cause. A bigger cause which I think makes no sense whatsoever. National security without fundamental freedom, countering terrorism without the moderate voices, countering violent extremism and creating counter-speech without those very people who are right now in jail for doing just that. That to me is meaningless. And I just want to end my quick remark with the words from Justice Douglas. As nightfall does not come all at once, neither does oppression. In both cases, there is a twilight when everything remains unseemingly unchanged. And it is in such twilight that we must all be most aware of the change in the air, however slight, lest we become unwitting victims of darkness. I think we are right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Agnes. Anne?
I want to talk about, you were discussing the rise of disinformation and propaganda, and I should say this has been on my mind a lot the last week because I was in Germany actually as a State Department speaker, meaning the State Department was paying my way there to go and give a presentation to journalists, to journalism students, and to some general audiences about Russia's global media strategy. It was my presentation. I came up with it. The suggested headline had disinformation in it, and I said, let's take that word out. I'm happy to talk about what Russia is doing in terms of a global strategy. You know, the notion of rising disinformation and propaganda, yeah, I mean, information is available everywhere now, so we're all certainly bombarded with all kinds of stuff. But, you know, it's not new. It's, you know, the Soviet Union, of course, had a horrible system of propaganda and censorship. And unfortunately, the end of the Soviet Union didn't end that, and several of the countries that were formed after it collapsed. Arab countries just had a terribly stagnant press situation until Al Jazeera came in the late 1990s, and began to, you know, broadcast information that people had not had any access to before. But Al Jazeera was deemed propaganda by many in the U.S. In the wake of 9/11, Colin Powell went to the Emir of Qatar and said, you know, can't you stop them broadcasting that anti-American propaganda? So it's, you know, this is an issue that's been around for quite a while. I think Al Jazeera started something very important because they were using satellite technology to send their broadcasts well beyond the borders of one country. And that was really the beginning of the idea of the state-funded global TV news channel. And now we've got a number of countries doing it. France, Russia, China, Iran has press TV, and they're differing quality and differing approaches. We have former students who work at France 24, which is an excellent channel. You know, there are others where I've had students graduating who asked about, you know, going to work for something. I said I would never work there. They don't always heed that advice. But of all of these channels that are out there, the one that is the focus of a lot of attention from the State Department and, you know, from other parts of U.S. foreign policy and also in the press is Russia Today, now called RT. You know, it's been called the greatest instrument in Russia's information war. John Kerry called it a propaganda bullhorn. You referred to it in something that you wrote as a distortion machine. And I would agree with plenty of that criticism. But the constant drumbeat of denunciations begins to make it sound like we're afraid of this channel, of RT. And why would we fear it? We're not living inside Russia where, you know, the Kremlin has indeed put a stranglehold on independent media. There's very little space left there for independent media, good journalism. You know, it's not the case here. We have choices. We don't ever have to watch RT. We don't ever have to look at Sputnik, which is the Russian website for news, or read Russia Behind the Headlines, the insert that comes in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and other newspapers. So we've got choices in this information war, if that's what one wants to call it. And you know, what I would suggest is that we spend less time being concerned about RT and whatever its impact might be here, and focus more on the situation within Russia and media there, and what can we do to try to put pressure on Putin and the Kremlin to ease up on that.
Thank you, Anne. Joel?
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And the instructions, as Steve mentioned, were that we should respond extemporaneously to Rick's remarks, and I feel I'm the only one who's complied with these instructions, but not deliberately. I actually had some notes, but I left them at my office, so I'm just going to have to wing it. But let me be fair here. Look, we advocated at CPJ for greater engagement from the U.S. government around the issues of press freedom and on behalf of imprisoned journalists. And so I do need to say thank you, because I've seen a response. I do feel that that has happened. And I can see evidence of it. I really think the U.S. played a key role, for example, in advocating for the release of bloggers who were imprisoned in Vietnam. I do think that the pressure from the administration, granted the context was less than ideal, which was President Obama's visit to Ethiopia, in which I don't think human rights was really high on the agenda, but his mere presence and decision to visit, as well as back-channel discussions, resulted in the release of many of these bloggers, these Zone 9 bloggers, and other imprisoned journalists in Ethiopia. And that's an outstanding result. But of course, the policy is extremely inconsistent. Agnes pointed out some examples where there's some contradictions. Bahrain certainly comes to mind. I certainly think there could be great engagement in Egypt. And yes, the national security paradigm is the framework. And so the security issues, the less leverage the U.S. is willing to apply. And that's unfortunate. And I really want to point to a recent example that troubles me, which is Secretary Kerry's visit, which is going on now, to Central Asia, where, for example, in Uzbekistan, you have a journalist who's been in prison for longer than any other journalist anywhere in the world. You have serious press freedom and human rights situations in all of these countries. And to Secretary, you talked about the importance of raising these issues publicly. I agree. Secretary Kerry did not raise these issues publicly, and he didn't even object when a Washington Post reporter was thrown out of a press conference for asking a question about human rights. Let me make the point that and everyone who's been in the field as a journalist knows this, the perception that you operate independently of government is probably the thing that is keeps you the safest. I mean, that is the life or death thing. When your back is against the wall and you can say, I'm independent of government, I have nothing to do with government, and that's critically important. So any advocacy by the U.S. government or any government on behalf of journalists and press freedom compromises that to a certain extent, and we know that. And so the question is, but in this environment, you're not going to be able to convince Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State that you're an independent entity. So that argument is already lost, and the situation has reached such proportions, such a crisis level, that these trade-offs have to be made, and you have to figure out, are there certain situations in which U.S. government, which it's appropriate to form what I call sort of an uncomfortable coalition, certainly around training of local journalists on safety issues. I think that's an appropriate role, one we would support. But this is something that needs constant analysis and reframing, recalibration to figure out the cost benefit. And the final point I want to make is really about, frankly, I'm troubled that you would talk about both issues at the same event. In other words, that your advocacy on behalf of journalists and your efforts to counter what you call propaganda. Now, obviously, if you use the case of the Islamic State, this is, if you look at this continuum here, this is on the extreme end, and of course, it's kind of easy to make that argument when you're citing as an example. But this is a continuum. And so there is an inherent contradiction in saying we fight on behalf of this kind of journalism, and of course we do everything we can to prevent this other kind of propaganda, because it's somewhere along that continuum these calls get pretty hard to make. They get pretty hard to make, and they're exploited by governments around the world who draw that line in a completely different place. They consider Certainly in Turkey or Egypt is a perfect example, where contradicting the government narrative, according to the new law that they've passed, is essentially around national security issues, has been criminalized. So these things need to be separated, and I would propose that the proper framework globally is the First Amendment. I really think that you should be looking at all speech and saying, is this speech that if it were taking place in the United States would be protected by the First Amendment? The First Amendment and what it represents has to guide U.S. policy, not just in a domestic legal framework, but globally, because you're right that it's an outlier in terms of the international legal framework, but it's what distinguishes us and what inspires us and what gives us standing and influence and meaning when we operate in this space. So my view is that those values are essential to our identity and should never be compromised. And creating this false dichotomy around national security, as I think Agnes outlined in very powerful terms, is not in our long-term interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. Thanks to all of you. Rick, let me just give you an open-ended CNBC-style right of reply, and you have 30 seconds. And I'd like you to pick a fight with someone on the no. Please talk to each of the panelists if you wish.
No,
but,
yes, no. Well, thank you for that. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kind of take this. This would be my order. I'm going to respond to Anne, then Anya, and then Joel, who kind of wrapped everything up. I'll address some of those issues. These are all super smart points, and because Anne, yours were the sort of the most tailored, and we're talking about the Russian information space and RT. I'll put that also in the context of ISIL for a second, because there's a lot of media, I would say misinformed media in the US about that we are losing the information war against ISIL and we're losing the information war against Russia. ISIL's popularity in the Muslim world is in the single digits everywhere. When you ask whether people approve of their methods, it goes to under 1%. They've recruited, let's say at the high end, 30,000 foreign fighters, which is 1/1000th of 1% of the Muslim world. I wouldn't call that winning the information war. And coming from a media and communications background, that's losing. If you look at what has happened with Russia since the invasion, the annexation of Crimea, and their what they're doing in eastern Ukraine, with also their spending in RT, Pew did a poll recently in 38 of the 40 countries in Europe and the periphery. Putin's standing and Russia's standing has plummeted since that point. I don't call that winning the information war either. I tried to get some numbers from Nielsen about RT's popularity in the United States, for example, and Nielsen doesn't have numbers because there are fewer than 20,000 people in the US who watch. Their numbers of popularity in Germany, in France, in the UK are tiny, in the 1% to 2% realm.
So aren't you sort of confirming Anne's point that we should stop talking about them?
Yes. But I'm not in the people that raise them as a bogeyman. But I do think, for example, in the social media space, what Russia is doing with these troll farms are things which are kind of effective. And I would argue that in the Russian periphery, not within Russia itself, there's a kind of campaign going on, and I think of those people as swing voters between East and West, between a Western vision of free speech and free economies and entrepreneurship, and an Eastern vision of demand economies and autocracies and a narrowing of free speech space. So I feel we need to reach out to them. So I think we're in agreement. Anya's point about counterterrorism and CVE is a very difficult one, and my brief time as a diplomat reveals to me that what diplomacy is about is actually different and mixed messages, where we are working with the same country on some issues which have a certain amount of urgency, and we are behind the scenes criticizing that same country and working with them to change. Counterterrorism and CVE, which there's a distinction, of course, but I'm going to elide that for a second. There's a great urgency in the counterterrorism front. CVE is a longer-term thing, and with the focus on counterterrorism and counter-violent extremism, there are sometimes difficult conversations that we have with our allies that, on the one hand, we need to cooperate with you on counterterrorism, but on the other hand, you have to do better on repressing your own society, on repressing free speech in your own space. And these are very difficult conversations, and these are conversations that happen behind closed doors, and these are conversations where sometimes we get results and sometimes we don't. You've mentioned the Gulf states and our alliances with them on the counterterrorism front. We do have those conversations with the Gulf states about their own free speech space, and they're difficult conversations. And I do think one of the things with these alliances is that we have frank conversations, and they understand that we do have those conversations. We work with Russia on a host of things as well. We work with China on a host of things as well, and we have very difficult conversations about freedom of speech, about what those countries do to journalism and how they regard journalism. I mean, to pivot from there to what Joel was saying about the First Amendment. I mean, I'm as close to a First Amendment absolutist as it's possible to be. You mentioned, Justice Douglas. I'm very close to his view. But in traveling around the world, that absolute free speech space where, as the Justice said, we don't defend the speech that we love, we defend the speech that we hate, is not really understood around the world. If you look at the Charlie Hebdo disaster, tragedy, people in France, people in Europe don't understand that we protect the kind of speech which often causes violence or can cause violence. There's been a rise of hate speech laws around the world. That's a different model than the First Amendment. I don't know how exportable the First Amendment is.
No, that's not. But that's.
But I do think that we do speak up for these values, which are in some ways unique in America, but we do want to export as much as we can. You mentioned as well, Joel, the situations that arise because of counter-violent extremism and counterterrorism. It's something that everybody at the State Department is aware of. Everybody understands that these are difficult choices. And there's a continuum that we all operate under in various spheres between security and national security and privacy and free speech on the other end of the continuum. I mean, we're always in search of a more perfect union. We've never found the perfect balance for that, but we argue it out, which is what democracy is about. We try to promote those values abroad, and it's not always so easy to do so. So I know I haven't given perfect answers to your questions, but I'm trying to search for a more perfect answer and a more perfect union at the same time.
So thank you. We're really running just a little bit behind plan, so we'll maybe extend the session by about 10 minutes. That still only gives us time for maybe 3 or 4 questions from the audience. So if those of you who have questions would like to line up behind the microphone, Karen will make sure we have the right number without it being a musical chairs contest. And let me just take the host's prerogative to ask one question. I guess it's for all 4 of you would be qualified to answer it, but I'm curious just at the meat and potatoes level, maybe Joel and Rick, since you're most actively involved in this right now. It seems to me one reason why we're here having this conversation and so many other fora is the statistics you gave about how perilous journalism is, both to life and limb, but also in terms of loss of liberty these days, as compared to, quite practically speaking, 5 years or 10 years ago. And we touched on some of the structural reasons why journalists have become targets. But my question is about the effectiveness of advocacy. I feel like I grew up as a mid-career journalist, you know, as a letter writer and a campaigner and a government pressure organizer to try to get journalists out of jail. And one senses that the tools are less effective than they were. So my question is, do you agree or disagree? And that's true for civil society advocacy as well. And whatever you think of that proposition, what is it that works? So if we in this profession wanted to do everything we could for our international colleagues to get them out of prison and get them out of harm's way, what should we actually prioritize by way of advocacy in this day and age?
Well, I'll go first then, because you're all looking at me. I think there's a disconnect between what the private sector does compared to what governments do. I'm humble about what we can do, although I would say in all of these private meetings, we always bring up the case of imprisoned journalists, of repression of journalists. I was on Morning Joe this morning, and Joe raised the idea of, you know, why didn't we make the entire Iran negotiations, nuclear negotiations, hostage in effect to the release of Jason Rezaian from the Washington Post? Well, we don't do that. They're on separate lines. The Secretary of State brings up, you know, Jason at every meeting, but one is not dependent on the other, and those talks were P5+1, so it wasn't just the US and Iran. But I know these things come up in private, and I know we have leverage, and we have leverage with the Chinese, we have leverage with many other countries, and what diplomacy is about balancing different interests at the same time. I would say, though, with the rise of social media and worldwide media, there can be fantastic campaigns within the private sector and media organizations that have a lot of power. You have a bully pulpit. You do great campaigns, CPJ does, but you know, why aren't news organizations out there campaigning? The Washington Post campaigns for Jason all the time, but I don't see.
And they don't
other
have
news
any
organizations.
business interests in
sorry?
they don't have business interests in sensitive countries. I wonder if that's a reason.
But I'm saying this is just also the power of publicity and the power of negative publicity to those countries, which those countries do react to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try and answer that in the simplest way I can, which is this is simply a power dynamic. You know, it is, in certain circumstances, certain governments believe that it is in their interest to jail journalists because it's a pretty effective way of censoring information. And the question is, what is the cost they pay for that, and is the cost worth paying? And in order to increase the cost, there are various steps you can take, and you have to look at each country separately and figure out, you know, what weight you can put on the other side of the scale. So that used to be a lot easier when there was, you know, certain 5-pound weights. You could just put it on the scale. Now there are, you know, hundreds of weights that each weigh an ounce, and you've got to put them all on the scale. So the complexity of mobilizing these kinds of campaigns is just like the media itself. The PowerPoints are fractured. And you've got to mobilize, you've got to push governments to respond, you've got to push the media, you've got to run campaigns on social media, you've got to hit allies, but they still work because it's simply a power equation. It's simply with a scale on one side or the other, so it's just more complicated to put enough weight on the other side of the scale, but it can still be done.
Thank you. Okay, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. I'm a reporter with Newtown Dynasty Television. I'm Vivian. And my question, I have two questions. One,
Maybe
the
just
first one.
one, if you can choose one, since we're just about out of time.
Okay. So recently, the NGO Freedom House, they released a report on the freedom on the net. And China was ranked the last one. So the impact is not only to people there, but also to the world. So my question, but we also know there are lots of people in China, they use the certain tools like the FreeGate or the Alger Surf to view the websites blocked by the firewall in China. And actually, the developer of these tools are located. The company are located in U.S. So my question is, do U.S. have any plan to support these companies to help improve the freedom of the internet in the world.
So you mentioned that that Freedom House study, which I believe actually suggested that there are only 15% of the countries in the world have what they consider a free speech space. The U.S. is one of them. China is certainly not. I don't think anyone would argue that it's a free speech space. There's the great firewall that they have there. When I was editor of Time, I knew not only were my journalists under a great deal of pressure, the magazine was often banned and censored. Unlike Russia, for example, where you can read the New York Times and you can read CNN.com and Western media, in China, those sites are often blocked and regular Chinese citizens don't have access to them. We have addressed publicly and privately with China, for example, the passage of their recent NGO law, which requires NGOs to register and be monitored. We think that is not in the best interests of our relationship, not in the best interests of having a kind of greater voices and diversity and opinion in China. So we have publicly and privately argued against that. So I would say that the U.S. government is staunch in that area, and in the trips that I've made to China, we bring up all of those issues, including the right of American speakers and journalists to live and work in China. That's something that comes up on every visit.
Thank you. Can I ask the
one
next
more
question?
question?
I'm
Okay.
sorry, we have a long line and just about out of time. Thank you, though, so much for your question.
Khalil Marzouk, I am one of the top opposition leader in Bahrain, and my Secretary General is just in jail because of some public speeches, which is non-violent and wanting to establish democracy.
Speak up a little bit? Thank you.
Wanting to establish democracy in Bahrain. I think your colleagues in the State Department and White House knows about the situation in Bahrain. My 2 points, very quick. Is
Questions, please, yeah.
Can we establish freedom of space for journalists while the whole community is not having the luxury of freedom of expression? The other point is legislation. You mentioned very important point about legislation, which is the authoritarian regimes always chase up journalists, politicians, activists on basis of legislation. What efforts the State Department and the administration, U.S. administration, is to help the situation in Bahrain and other places to get inclusive, and with a process of legislation that is inclusive, that represent the people, so that these are the governance, because all the government will say that if you talk to them about legislation, this is a sovereign issue within the country. You cannot just ask us to change legislations. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a hard issue. And these are countries that are our allies, that we have interests, particularly in the counterterrorism and counterviolent extremism space. But I can assure you, we talk to them all the time about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, journalists' rights, the right of journalists to be critical of governments. But you're right, certainly in the sense that they have a different view of that, and that there are different countries where what we say in our free speech space that's critical of the government would be cause for journalists to be harassed or even imprisoned. And it's a constant communication and a constant negotiation, and that is what we're trying to do in our diplomacy behind the scenes.
I think
Great, so
it's
thank you.
extend to-
Yeah, thank you very much. That was obviously a
you
very
out.
dangerous question that you were asking. Yes. So as we prepare for the last question, I just want to go back to the first questioner at the microphone, because I think she was also asking a specific question I'm curious about, which was, I know that during the first Obama term, the State Department did fund open source technologies to try to create spaces that citizens around the world, kind of neutral technology that would protect speech or communication without it having to cross national systems. And I wonder, is that still the policy of the State Department to try to develop, I know there's a term of art for these kinds of technologies, these disintermediation technologies.
I can honestly tell you that that's not something that we are working on in public diplomacy and public affairs. And of course, there was an example of that, for example, in Cuba, where we tried that. It's my personal opinion that the ingenuity of people around the world to figure out their own workarounds to try to get free access to information is probably outweighs by a great margin anything that the U.S. government could do in that respect.
Okay, thank you. So our last question. Thank you.
My name is Devanch and I'm a student at the J School over here. So you had mentioned that the US has always spoken out in favor of an independent media while maintaining a balance in diplomacy. But if you look at the examples of how the US has conducted relationships with different countries like Azerbaijan, for instance, like Azerbaijan has imprisoned like many journalists over the years, and one of them has been imprisoned for 328 days now. At the same time, the US has just supported their accession to the World Trade Organization, has named it as a beneficiary under the generalized system of preferences. So I'm saying at what level is the US actually maintaining this balance and maintaining and making an independent media actually a priority?
You know the journalist that he's talking about?
Probably talking about
Khadija.
Yeah.
It's well known.
Yeah.
Yes.
You want to talk about that situation for a second?
Well, no, I mean, I can only say, you know, I fully agree with your assessment about Azerbaijan, and I think it's a very fair question. The U.S. policy towards Azerbaijan has not prioritized defense of civil society or independent media, and I think the case he's referring to is Khadija Ismailova, who's the worked for RFERL, is the leading investigative journalist in Azerbaijan, has been sentenced to 7.5 years in prison. Civil society media organizations that defend freedom of speech are also been essentially crushed. So the panorama for free expression in Azerbaijan is bleak and getting bleaker.
And it's a very fair question. As you know, the Secretary is in Central Asia right now and convened the 5 Central Asian countries. I'm not there with him. I can certainly assure you that he brings up these issues behind the scenes. In the case of the Azerbaijani journalist, I'm also the Secretary's representative on the board of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees RFERL. We have made frequent and loud protests about that particular situation. The BBG is an arm of government, and they are even more outspoken about the repression of journalists, and particularly when there are journalists that are affiliated with BBG and RFERL or Voice of America. So I hear you, and I know we need to do better, but I want to assure you that there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes as well.
Great. You want to say something on this?
Yes. Look, if there was one word that you've mentioned more often than anything else is dialogue and behind the scene, 2-3 words. I think what I've heard and some of us have said is the fact that right now the national security agenda is working on silencing and doing nothing, certainly for freedom of expression. The fundamental values that should accompany US foreign policy, for which the US has been really, for human rights activists, one of the key leader over the years, that is not happening. And you can talk about behind the door as long as there is not an integration of the advocacy for fundamental values within the national security agenda. We will be meeting year after year. More people will be imprisoned, more media will be targeted, more moderate voices will be silenced, making your goal of counter-speech a big joke, frankly, because the people who can do the most effective counter-speech to ISIS right now in Iraq, in Syria, in Bahrain, in UAE, in all the Gulf region, or indeed in Jordan increasingly, are imprisoned. You know, it's not about behind the scene, it's about integrating press freedom, freedom of expression within the national security agenda, because national security cannot occur. You know, it just is not going to happen, whether it's here or elsewhere, without the inclusion of the protection of basic human rights. They've got to go hand in hand, and right now it's not. And it must be acknowledged, and it must be fought against. I understand it's not your role, you're a diplomat, but I think I'm giving you a message that many of us activists are feeling so badly at the moment, that the protection of fundamental freedom is not even not even in the middle of your thinking. It's way behind. It's an afterthought. That's not good enough.
Okay. Well, I think you deserve the last word, but also I want to acknowledge, Rick, as we wrap up, I appreciate your willingness to share the stage with opponents, people whose activism you could easily predict would run against the grain of your remarks. That to me is evidence of an unusual willingness to practice what you preach in terms of free dialogue and expression. So thank you for being here tonight. And with that, let me ask you to make the last remarks, and we'll let folks get on their way a little bit after time.
Well, in that context, Steve, thank you for saying that. One of the things I always say to public diplomacy officers around the world is that there's often very good reason why people around the world don't like our policy. They have good reasons to not like it, but we need to listen to them. We need to be in a conversation with them, so people at the end say, well, we may not like their policy, but they're the country that listens to us, that gets in a conversation with us, that entertains criticism. And I would say, Anya, you mentioned the words that I said most frequently. I didn't talk about security or national security most frequently, even though it is the single overarching and first requirement of government is to protect national security. Where there is repression of free speech around the world, it's not always in the interest of national security. I mentioned, we talked about China, we talked about Russia. Those are not national security interests which you're saying are getting in the way of our promotion of human rights and free speech. We talk about it in those places, and it's not human right, it's not national security that prevents us from talking about it. We do talk about it. In the Middle East and the rise of violent extremism, that is a place where those values come up against each other, and I think it's a fair criticism. It's something that I experienced myself, and it's not an easy discussion to have, but it is still a discussion that we do have, and I think the U.S. as a beacon of human rights around the world, it's one of the things that still resonates about America with people all over the world, and I see that every place I go.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.